"I ain't worth much, but I can trade what I got for a warm place to sleep," she said, her voice thin as the wind slipping through the cracks of the cabin walls. And for a moment the fire didn't even seem to crackle, like the whole world paused to hear what the lone cowboy would do next. Before we go any further, think about this. Out here, where the land stretches wider than a man's regrets, what a person chooses not to take can matter more than anything they ever could. Ethan Cole stood by the small iron stove, one hand resting on the edge of the table worn smooth by years of solitude. His boots still dusted from 10 miles of dry trail, and he didn't answer her right away, didn't even turn, just listened to the way her breathing caught between each word, like she wasn't sure if she was asking for shelter or surrendering something she couldn't ever get back. Outside, the night pressed close, cold enough to freeze the edge of a water bucket solid, the kind of cold that made a person desperate in ways most folks back east would never understand. She stood just inside the doorway, shoulders tight, hands clutching a small leather cord at her neck like it was the last thing tying her to who she used to be, her dark hair tangled from days on the move, her boots worn down to the stitching, and even without looking at her, Ethan could feel the weight of what she'd said hanging in the air heavier than the smell of smoke and old pine. He had seen men in towns not 20 miles from here laugh at women like her, bargain them down like cattle, pretend kindness while taking what they wanted, and he had walked away from those places every time, not because he was better, but because something in him refused to stay where a person's worth could be measured that way. The fire snapped softly, sending a brief flicker of light across the walls, and in that moment, Ethan finally moved, slow and deliberate, reaching for the thick wool blanket folded over the back of a chair, the same one he'd carried through 3 winters and more nights alone than he cared to count. He stepped past her without a word, close enough that she flinched just slightly, like she expected something else entirely, something harsher, something familiar. But all he did was set the blanket down on the narrow bed by the wall, smoothing it once with his calloused hand before stepping back. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't the same silence as before, this one steadier, like the kind that comes before a storm decides not to break. "You can sleep there," he said finally, his voice low, steady as the plains at dawn, and still he didn't look at her, not out of indifference, but out of something harder to explain, something that felt a lot like respect. She didn't move right away, didn't even seem to breathe, and when she finally spoke again, the edge in her voice had shifted, confusion threading through the exhaustion. "That's all." And Ethan paused at the stove, staring into the small flame as it bent and straightened against the draft. "That's all," he said, and outside, the wind carried on across the open land, but inside that cabin, something quiet and unspoken had already begun to change. The woman did not move for a long time after he spoke, as if the words had reached her slower than the cold, and Ethan could hear it in the quiet shift of her boots against the wooden floor, the hesitation of someone who had learned that kindness usually came with a cost she could not afford. The fire settled into a steady glow, casting low amber light across the cabin, touching the edges of her face just enough for him to see the exhaustion there, not just from the miles she had walked but from something heavier, something carried longer than any trail could measure. She finally stepped toward the bed, each movement careful, like she was crossing ground that might give way beneath her, and when her fingers brushed the wool blanket, she paused again, pressing her hand into it, as if testing whether it was real. Ethan turned slightly then, not enough to face her fully, but enough to see the small leather cord still wrapped tight around her hand, the way her thumb rubbed over whatever hung from it, a habit formed from needing something constant in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. "You can take the water by the stove," he said, nodding toward the dented tin cup. "It is still warm," and his voice carried no expectation, no weight, just an offering placed where she could choose to take it or not. She looked at him then, really looked, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to find the part where the bargain changed, where the hidden demand would show itself, but it did not come, and that seemed to unsettle her more than anything else. "Why?" she asked, the word quiet but sharp, cutting through the stillness with more force than her earlier offer ever had, and Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he knows there is no answer that will satisfy what the question is really asking. "Because you knocked," he said simply, and for a second, Something flickered across her face, confusion first, then something softer, something that had not been there when she stepped through the door. She lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, not fully trusting it yet, still holding that cord in her hand. And the cabin seemed to shift around them, no longer just a place of wood and nails, but something quieter, something holding a line neither of them had to speak out loud. Outside, the wind dragged across the plains in long, empty stretches, rattling the loose shutter against the side of the cabin, a reminder of how easily a person could be swallowed by the land if they had nowhere to stand. Ethan moved back to the stove, adding a small piece of wood, watching the flame catch and steady again. And behind him, he heard it, the faint sound of her settling. Under the blanket, not with comfort, not yet, but with something close enough to rest. He did not turn to look, did not need to, because out here, a man learned early that some things were not meant to be witnessed, only respected, and in that small, quiet cabin, with nothing but the sound of wind and fire between them, the distance he kept was the only thing that made the space safe. Morning came slow across the plains, not with noise but with light, pale and thin at first, slipping through the cracks in the wooden walls and stretching across the floor like it was careful not to wake anything that had finally found rest. Ethan was already awake, sitting by the stove with a tin cup in his hand, the last of the heat from the fire fading into the cool air, and he did not turn when he heard the quiet shift behind him, the blanket moving, the slow breath of someone coming back to the world one careful moment at a time. She sat up without a word, the wool still wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes adjusting to the light as if she expected the place to be gone, like everything else that had not lasted in her life. But the cabin was still there, the same rough wood, the same small table, the same man sitting where he had been the night before. For a long second she just watched him, her fingers tightening again around the leather cord at her neck, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried something different now, not strength, not yet, but something steadier than before. "You did not ask my name." And Ethan took a slow sip from the cup before setting it down, the metal making a soft sound against the wood. "Names do not change much out here," he said, then after a pause, "but you can give it if you want to keep it." And that answer seemed to catch her off guard in a way she had not prepared for. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her boots touching the floor with a quiet firmness, as if she was testing not just the ground but herself. "Naeli," she said, the name soft but clear, carrying something older than the land they stood on, and Ethan nodded once, not repeating it, just letting it settle in the room like it belonged there. Outside, the wind had calmed, leaving behind a stillness that only came after a long night, the kind that made every sound feel sharper, more honest. And in that quiet, Naeli stood slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her before stepping toward the door, her movements more certain now, but still careful, like she had learned to expect the ground to shift without warning. She stopped just short of the handle, her hand hovering there, as if leaving required more courage than arriving ever had, and, without turning back, she asked, "You are not afraid of what they will say?" And Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the narrow window where the first full stretch of sunlight touched the dry land beyond. "People talk," he said, his voice even. "It does not make them right." And that was all he offered. No defense, no explanation, just a line drawn quiet and firm. Naeli lowered her hand from the door then, not opening it yet. And for the first time since she had stepped inside, she seemed unsure of where to go next, not because she had nowhere to be, but because for one night, she had been somewhere she did not have to trade herself for. Space, and that kind of place was harder to leave than any road she had walked. She turned slightly, just enough to look at him again, and there was something new in her eyes now, not gratitude, not exactly, but recognition, like she had seen something she had not known still existed. And Ethan did not meet her gaze, not out of distance, but because some things, once understood, did not need to be held on to. They only needed to be allowed to stand. The morning light grew stronger, filling the cabin inch by inch, and with it came the quiet weight of what the day might bring. Because out here, the world did not forget easily, and kindness, no matter how silent, had a way of being noticed by the wrong kind of people. The door never opened, not right away, and that hesitation lingered in the air longer than the cold ever had. like the morning itself was waiting to see what choice she would make now that no one was forcing her hand. Ethan rose slowly from his chair, not to approach her, but to move past the moment, pouring what remained of the warm water into the tin cup and setting it on the table where she could reach it without crossing the room. A small distance that meant more than it looked. Nayeli watched the motion, her eyes following the cup, then his hands, then the space he left between them, and something in her posture shifted again, not smaller, not guarded, but uncertain in a different way, like she was learning a rule she had never been taught before. "You should eat before you go," Ethan said, pulling a piece of dry bread from a cloth bundle near the stove, placing it beside the cup without looking at her, and there was no insistence in his tone, only the quiet offering of a man who had learned that people stayed or left on their own terms. She did not reach for it at first, her hand still resting near the door, but her eyes moved back to the table, to the bread, to the water, and then to him, searching again for the part where this turned into something else, something owed, but it never came. Outside, a faint sound carried across the open land, distant at first, the low rhythm of hooves against hard ground, steady and unhurried, the kind of sound that did not belong to travelers passing through, but to men who knew exactly where they were going. Ethan heard it too, his head tilting just slightly, his gaze shifting toward the window without urgency, but not without awareness either. And for the first time since morning, something like tension entered the room, quiet but real, like a line drawn across the floor neither of them had noticed before. Nayeli turned her head toward the sound, her body going still in a way that spoke of recognition, not fear, but the kind of readiness that came from knowing what followed footsteps like that. And her fingers tightened once more around the leather cord at her neck, the small object hidden in her palm pressed close as if it carried more than memory. "They will not understand," she said softly, not looking at him this time, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the walls. And Ethan leaned one shoulder against the table, his arms resting loosely at his sides. "They do not have to," he replied, his voice even, not dismissing her words, but not yielding to them either. The hoofbeats grew clearer now, closing the distance, 3 riders at least, maybe more, their approach steady enough to suggest confidence or certainty, or both, and the quiet of the cabin began to feel thinner, stretched between what had been shared inside and what was about to arrive from outside. Nayeli stepped away from the door then, not opening it, not leaving, but not hiding either. And in that small movement, something changed again, something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with choice. Ethan did not reach for a weapon, did not move toward the window, did not prepare for anything the way most men would. He simply stood where he was, present, grounded, as if whatever came next would meet him exactly as he had been all along. The sound of hooves slowed just beyond the cabin, then stopped, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because out here, it was never the noise that carried meaning, it was the moment when it ended. Nayeli drew a slow breath, steadying herself, and for the first time since she had spoken those words the night before, she did not look like someone offering herself to survive. She looked like someone deciding who she was allowed to be, and that decision, quiet as it was, changed the shape of the room before a single knock ever came. The knock came slow, deliberate, not loud but certain, the kind that did not ask for permission because it already believed it had the right to enter, and the sound settled into the wood of the cabin like it belonged there. Ethan did not move right away, his eyes steady, his posture unchanged, as if the door was just another part of the room, and whatever stood behind it would have to meet him on equal ground. Nayeli stood a few steps back now, no longer near the door, her shoulders squared in a quiet way that had not been there the night before, her hand still wrapped around the leather cord, but not clutching it as tightly, not like she needed it to hold herself together anymore. The knock came again, followed by a voice, low and controlled, carrying the tone of a man used to being answered. "Cole, we know you are in there." And Ethan let out a slow breath, not tired, not tense, just aware, and then he stepped forward, each movement measured, stopping just short of the door before, resting his hand against the wood. He did not open it immediately, and in that pause, something passed between him and Nayeli, not words, not a glance, just an understanding that whatever happened next would not change what had already been decided inside these walls. "What do you want?" Ethan said through the door, his voice even, not raised, not lowered, and there was a short silence before the reply came. A second voice this time, sharper, edged with something closer to judgment than authority. "We are looking for someone. A girl passed through town last night, caused some trouble, and we were told she might have come this way." And the words hung there, carefully chosen, not outright accusing, but not innocent either. Naeli did not speak, did not move, but her eyes shifted slightly toward Ethan, watching, not with fear, but with a quiet readiness, like she had already prepared herself for whatever answer he might give. Ethan's hand stayed on the door, his fingers resting flat against the grain, feeling the solidness of it, the barrier it created, and the weight of what stood on either side. And when he spoke again, there was no hesitation in his voice. "No trouble here," he said, simple, direct, leaving no space for negotiation. Outside, a brief murmur passed between the men, low enough that the words could not be made out, but the tone carried doubt, maybe suspicion, maybe something else, and then the first voice returned, calmer now, but firmer. "You mind if we take a look inside?" And this time, Ethan did not answer right away, not because he needed to think, but because the question itself had already crossed a line that could not be stepped back from. The cabin held still around them, the fire reduced to a faint glow, the morning light now fully spread across the floor, touching the edges of everything that had been quiet just moments before, and Naeli straightened just slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply standing in the place she had chosen. Ethan's grip on the door did not tighten, did not shift, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something new, not louder, not harsher, but grounded in a way that made the air itself seem to settle. "You can stand right where you are," he said. "That is close enough." And outside, the silence that followed was different from before, not uncertain, but measuring, like the men beyond the door were weighing more than just his words. Inside, nothing moved. Not the man, not the woman, not even the small flicker of flame in the stove. And in that stillness, the truth of the night before stood quiet but unshaken, because out here, a man did not prove himself by what he took when no one was watching, but by what he refused, even when everyone was. The silence outside did not break right away. It stretched instead, thin and tense like wire pulled too tight. And then came the faint creak of leather, the subtle shift of weight as one of the men adjusted in his saddle, the kind of small movement that carried more meaning than any shouted threat ever could. "That is not how this works, Cole," the second voice said, sharper now, less patient, and there was something behind it, not just authority, but the comfort of numbers, of being backed by others who believed the same thing. Without needing to say it out loud, Ethan did not step away from the door, did not raise his voice, did not reach for anything to make his point stronger, because out here, strength was not proven by how loud a man could get, but by how steady he could remain when the ground started to shift beneath him. "It is how it works here," he answered, calm and even, like he was stating something as simple as the direction of the wind. And inside the cabin, Naeli's breathing slowed, not because the danger had passed, but because she understood something now, something about the man standing between her and that door. Outside, a third voice joined in, quieter, less certain. "We are just asking questions," it said, and that tone carried something different, not judgment, not force, but the echo of a man who was not entirely sure he should be standing where he was. The first voice cut back in before anything else could settle. "She does not belong here," he said, and the words landed harder than anything else so far, not loud, but heavy with the kind of thinking that turned people into things that could be moved, taken, or dismissed. Inside, Naeli's hand tightened again around the leather cord, but she did not lower her head this time, did not shrink into herself the way she had the night before. Instead, she stood straighter, her shoulders lifting just enough to change the shape of her shadow against the wall. And Ethan noticed it without turning, without needing to look, because some changes did not need eyes to be seen. "She is not something you get to place," Ethan said, and his voice did not rise, but it carried further this time, not in volume, but in weight, the kind that settled into a man's chest whether he agreed with it or not. Outside, another pause followed, longer now, filled with the quiet exchange of glances, of unspoken questions, and then the first voice came again, slower, measuring. You are choosing this over your standing in town. And there it was, not a threat, not directly, but a reminder of the lines that men drew around each other, the invisible boundaries that decided who belonged and who did not. Ethan leaned his forehead lightly against the door for a brief second, not out of weariness, but as if grounding himself in the solidness of it, the simple truth of wood and space and choice. And when he spoke again, it was softer, but clearer than anything he had said so far. I do not measure my standing by what you think I should do, he said, and those words did not push, did not challenge. They simply stood where they were placed. The wind outside picked up again, brushing across the open land, carrying dust and distance with it. And for a moment, no one spoke, not inside, not outside, as if the land itself had stepped in to remind them how small their arguments really were. Nayeli took one quiet step forward then, not toward the door, but into the space she had chosen to stand, and in that movement, there was no hesitation left, no bargaining, no offering, only presence, and Ethan remained where he was, his hand still resting against the door, not as a barrier, but as a line he had already decided would not be crossed, no matter who was standing on the other side. The words hung in the air long after Ethan spoke them, not because they were loud, but because they left no space for anything else to take their place. And outside, the men shifted again, not closer, not farther, just enough to show that something had changed in how they were standing there. You think this is about you, the sharp voice said after a moment, slower now, less certain than before, like it was searching for ground that no longer felt as steady, but it is not. And the statement carried less weight than it had a minute ago, as if saying it out loud had revealed how thin it really was. Inside the cabin, Nayeli took another step forward, not toward the door, but into the open space beside Ethan, her presence no longer something hidden behind him, but something that stood on its own. And when she spoke, her voice did not shake, did not lower. It carried clean and steady through the wood between them and the men outside. Then speak to me, she said, and that simple shift changed everything. There was a pause on the other side of the door, a longer one this time. The kind that comes when a man is not prepared for the person he is talking about to suddenly become. The person he has to answer to. You caused trouble in town, the first voice replied, but the certainty in it had dulled, the edges worn down by something they could not quite name, and Nayeli did not step back, did not look to Ethan. She stood where she was, her shoulders square, her hand finally loosening its hold on the leather cord, letting it fall against her chest where it belonged. I walked through your town, she said, and you decided what that meant, and there was no anger in her tone, no accusation sharpened for effect, just a truth placed plainly where it could not be bent. Outside, the quiet voice spoke again, softer now. Folks said you were asking for things, and that was where it turned, not into a confrontation, but into something else, something closer to a test. And Nayeli's eyes shifted briefly toward the table, toward the untouched bread and the tin cups still holding warmth, then back to the door. I asked for a place to sleep, she said, and then after a breath, steady and unbroken, what they heard was something else, and those words settled heavier than anything before, not because they were forceful, but because they left no room for denial without exposing what stood behind it. Ethan remained still beside her, not speaking, not stepping in, because this was not his moment to carry, and the restraint in that silence held as much weight as anything he could have said. Outside, the men did not answer right away, and in that silence, something shifted again, subtle but real, like a line drawn in the dust had just been seen for what it was, not law, not truth, just a mark made by someone who believed they had the right to draw it. The sharp voice did not return, and when the first voice finally spoke again, it had lost something it could not quite recover. We are just making sure things stay in order, he said, but even as the words came, they felt thinner, less certain, like they were being said out of habit more than belief. Nayeli did not respond this time, did not need to, because she had already stepped out of the place they had tried to put her in, and there was no going back to it now. The wind moved again across the open land, brushing against the cabin walls, carrying the quiet of something resolved without a single raised voice. And inside, the space between Ethan and Naeli held steady, not as protection, not as distance, but as something else entirely, something earned in silence, something that did not need to be defended because it had already been chosen. The silence after her words did not feel empty. It felt full, like something long buried had finally been set out in the open where no one could pretend not to see it. And outside, the men shifted again, not with confidence this time, but with the kind of uncertainty that comes when a story you believed in no longer holds its shape. A low murmur passed between them, quieter now, as if speaking too loudly might bring the truth into sharper focus than they were ready to face. And then one of the riders cleared his throat, not to assert himself, but to fill the space with something that felt safer than silence. "We heard things," he said, though even he seemed to know how thin that sounded now, like repeating it might make it stronger. Inside, Naeli's fingers finally released the leather cord completely, letting the small object at its end fall free against her chest, and in the growing light, it caught just enough sun to reveal itself. A small pendant, worn smooth by time, wrapped in simple silver with a piece of turquoise set at its center, not bright, not decorative, but carrying the kind of quiet meaning that did not need explanation. Ethan's eyes moved to it for the first time, not with surprise, but with recognition of something that belonged to a world beyond fences and town lines, something that had waited long before either of them stepped into this moment. Outside, one of the men noticed it too through the narrow gap in the window, his posture shifting slightly, his voice lowering as he spoke to the others, and though the words were not clear, the tone carried a different kind of awareness, not respect exactly, but the beginning of it. Naeli did not lift the pendant, did not present it. She simply stood with it visible, no longer hiding it in her palm, no longer holding it like something fragile that might be taken, and that alone changed how the room felt, as if the truth of who she was had been there all along, waiting for her to stop protecting it from the wrong kind of eyes. "You know what that means," the quieter voice said from outside, not to Ethan, not even fully to the others, but to himself as much as anyone, and the sharp voice did not answer this time, did not challenge it, because whatever certainty had carried him here had begun to slip through his fingers. Ethan remained still, his hand no longer pressed against the door, but resting at his side, his role in this moment shifting without a word, no longer the barrier, no longer the line, just a man standing where he had chosen to stand, and letting what was true speak for itself. Naeli took one small step closer to the center of the room, not toward the door, not toward escape, but toward herself, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, not defiance, not pleading, just clarity. "I did not come here to be measured," she said, and the words settled into the wood, the air, the silence beyond it, leaving no space for anything smaller to take hold. Outside, the men did not answer right away, and in that pause, something shifted one last time, not in force, not in power, but in understanding, quiet and incomplete, but real enough to change what would happen next. The wind moved again across the open land, carrying dust and distance, and for a moment, the world outside that cabin felt wider than it had before, not because anything had changed out there, but because something inside had finally been seen for what it was and could no longer be ignored. The shift came not with words, but with absence. The sharp voice did not return, the questions did not press further, and one by one, the men outside seemed to reconsider the ground beneath them, as if something unseen had made it less certain to stand on. A saddle creaked, then another, followed by the faint jingle of reins being adjusted, small sounds that carried the weight of a decision no one wanted to say out loud. "We got what we came for," the quieter voice said at last, not entirely convinced, but no longer willing to push against what stood inside that cabin, and the others did not argue, not because they agreed, but because something in the morning light, in the stillness, in the woman's voice, had made it harder to hold on to what they had believed when they rode up. The sound of hooves turned then, slow at first, then steady, pulling away across the open land, not hurried, not chased, just leaving, and the distance between them and the cabin stretched wider with every step, until the only thing left was the wind brushing over the dirt where they had stood. Inside, Neither Ethan nor Nieli moved right away, as if the moment needed time to settle fully before either of them stepped beyond it. And the quiet that followed was not the same as before. It carried something steadier now, something earned. Nieli looked down at the pendant resting against her chest, her fingers brushing it once, not to hold it tight, but to acknowledge it, and then she lifted her gaze toward the door, toward the world beyond it, no longer as a place she had to survive, but as a place she could walk through without lowering herself to be allowed to stay. Ethan stepped back from where he had been standing, giving the room its full space again, the same way he had the night before, and without a word, he reached for the tin cup on the table, sliding it a little closer to her, not as an offering this time, but as something already hers to take or leave. Nieli moved toward the door then, her step steady, her shoulders no longer carrying the weight they had when she first crossed that threshold, and when her hand reached the handle, she did not hesitate. The door opened with a soft creak, letting the morning air flow in, cool and clean, carrying the scent of dust and distance, and she stepped out into it without looking back, not because she was ungrateful, but because what had been given did not need to be held on to. It needed to be lived forward. Ethan watched her go, not from the doorway, not following, just standing where he was, letting the space between them remain what it had become, something defined not by closeness, but by respect. She walked a few yards out before pausing, the wide land stretching before her, and for a moment, she lifted her chin slightly, as if measuring the horizon in a way she had not allowed herself to do before. And then she kept going, her figure growing smaller against the open plains, but never once shrinking. Inside the cabin, the fire had gone quiet, the last embers glowing low, and Ethan turned back toward the stove, adding another piece of wood without urgency, without thought of what had just passed, because out here, a man did not mark moments like that with words or pride. He simply carried them forward in the way he chose to live the next one. And somewhere beyond the cabin, where the wind moved freely and the land did not remember names, a woman walked with something she had nearly lost, not taken, not given, but returned, and that was worth more than anything the world had tried to measure her by.